Hello and welcome to Converse with Global Digital Foundation. Today we're going to talk about freedom of speech. We thought that we had emerged since World War II from an era of authoritarianism, a time where speech was restricted by governments, into an era where speech is free, where we are allowed to contradict government accounts of events or problems, and where we're allowed to express disagreeable, even offensive views. But we find ourselves in a new era where freedom to express heterodox ideas seems under threat. A good example is, I suppose, or a possible example is the head of YouTube UK stating in 2020 that the platform would take down any material stating opinions about public health policy that contradicted the stated policies of the World Health Organization. We have had, of course, the removal of Donald Trump from Twitter, and more recently we've had the news that social media companies worked with public health authorities over suppressing some opinions about public health by various scholars. So I think now in the EU and in the UK, we have digital legislation affecting online speech with threats of massive fines for digital platforms who do not obey government orders to remove what lawmakers are calling misinformation or disinformation. Now, if you would like to get a foundational understanding of the issues of free speech, then you should get a copy of this book, Free Speech, A Global History from Socrates to Social Media. This is an historical account which takes us almost to the present day, and it explains how our freedom to speak and to publish what we like was achieved. And it also contains, I think, a warning that the gains that so many have fought and died for to achieve are fragile. Now, today I'm joined by the author of this book, Jacob Mchangama, to discuss these issues. Jacob is a lawyer, an advocate for free speech, and the founder and director of Justitia, a Copenhagen-based think tank focused on human rights and freedom of speech and rule of law. Jacob has served as a professor at the University of Copenhagen, specializing in international human rights from 2005 to 2012. He was the chief legal counsel of CEPOS, the Danish free market classical liberal think tank from 2008 to 2014. And in 2014, he founded Justitia, a think tank dedicated to protecting free speech rights. Jacob, you are very welcome.
Thank you so much, Paul. Great to be here.
Okay, the obvious question. Why did you feel the need to write this book? And why do we need to hear what you're saying in this book now?
Well, I've been sort of obsessed by free speech for a long time, even though it's a bit counterintuitive, having grown up in Denmark, where the threat to free speech is not very pressing compared to many other places in the world. But as you might remember, back in 2005, a Danish newspaper published a number of cartoons depicting the Muslim prophet Muhammad, and that sort of kicked off a big global battle of values, really, over the relationship between free speech and religion, and that was very formative for my understanding of free speech. But what I have often found is that people both on the right and the left have a very selective, unprincipled approach to free speech. They tend to talk about free speech and they need to defend it when it suits their underlying ideological preferences. And so when you look at the history of free speech, I think you can sort of zoom out from some of the current controversies that distort your understanding and approach to dilemmas due to your underlying biases, and get a better understanding of what's actually really at stake. And you might also see that many of the heroes and champions of free speech adopted positions on censorship and free speech that were less commendable and showed them to be less heroic, if you like.
And a lot of hypocrisy in the story.
Lots of hypocrisy. Yes. Milton's curse, as I called it, and yes. maybe that's something that those of us who are engaged in these debates in the present should keep in mind, that when we try to come up with excuses of why free speech is important, but for this corner of free speech, I think there should be limits. Is that really based on sort of a compelling argument, or is it merely because it suits our underlying biases?
There seems to me, and this is just an observation, and I'm not even sure if it's necessarily being brought out in your book, but obviously, I mean, there's an obvious correlation between the growth in the rights of free speech on the one hand and the growth of economic freedom and prosperity in Europe and the United States on the other hand. And I know you relate the two because obviously there's a kind of a, you have new technology as a result of innovation like printing and so on, and obviously broadcasting in the 20th century. But there's also this sort of disputatious moments in history, like the Reformation or the English Civil War, within which pamphleteering and expression plays a huge role. I mean, is there an intimate connection between what you might say is, political ferment and economic growth on the one hand, and free speech on the other?
Yeah, it's not something that I explore in depth, but I think and does it run? Does the causation run one way or the other? I'm sure experts could, there are better experts at looking at that than me. But it's, certainly you already see that actually with the emergence of universities in Europe in the Middle Ages,
Yeah.
where urbanization, economic growth, and increased leisure gives rise to a class of scholars who develop sort of a culture of poking around and a disputative method in the scholastic method that thrives, despite this picture of the Dark Ages, actually thrives on questioning things and sort of debating issues.
Mm.
And later periods builds on that. So even though Protestants might look back and say, well, what went on among Catholic scholastics was not real science, and they were mistaken, then really many of the later developments were built on that. And the more leisure you have, which is built on economic progress, the more time you have to think and do things that, apart from plowing the fields and so on. And of course, economic progress also brings about technological development. So printing press, mechanized printing press, radio, TV, internet, and so on.
It's a very, I suppose, the sense I have from reading the book, I suppose, is the sort of strong correlation, obviously, between political liberty and people who are seeking political liberty are clearly on the side of wanting to be able to express themselves. And in many cases, they're the underdogs, such as initially the Protestants, I guess, or the American colonists, or some of the English nonconformist movements who wanted, to have their own worldview, who wanted to live their own lives, and were sort of suppressed for, heresy or dissent or sedition. Do you think, though, that, I mean, so I know you focus on very much, I mean, it is a global history, and I think it is a global history, but obviously there are certain parts of the world where there hasn't been much free speech, probably since the Dark Ages. So the story really, I think, takes in, I suppose, Asia, India, I think you mentioned, Africa you talk about somewhat, and obviously the United States, and obviously Europe. Do you see us as, I mean, are you a progressive in the classical sense in this regard? Do you think that what you have documented is an inevitable, progress that is not under significant threat? Because I know you say at the end of your book, you talk about these great heroes in the past of free speech. If they came back today, they would think we live in this golden age. Now, you wrote the book 2 years ago, give or take. Are you still of that view, or is anything happening right now that could change your mind?
Yeah, no, I don't think there's, I think in many ways free speech has been the exception to human history, and I don't think the history of free speech has not sort of progressed in sort of a linear arch towards more and more. There's certainly been huge setbacks. I date the origin to free speech back to the Athenian democracy. Of course, the Athenian democracy did not last um, all that long, and it would be a very, very long time indeed before the Athenian democracy was even seen as something desirable. You basically have to get into the 19th century or the very late 18th century before you see the rehabilitation of sort of more egalitarian ideas of Athenian democracy. And there's been lots of setbacks and you know, brief periods of respite for free speech and then setbacks. You could look at the 19th century, sort of after the Napoleonic Wars. You know, that been the Enlightenment had set in motion a number of reforms spreading free speech, and then there was this huge reaction to that that lasted the better part of the 19th century, and only in the second half did you see a reversal of that and a trend towards more free speech. Of course, then you have World War One, you have World War Two,
You talk about World War One in America. I mean, there was a lot of suppression then, wasn't there, in
yes,
America?
and that also shows that those, you know, that the propertied classes, even if we accept that there's a relationship between economic freedom and progress and free speech, then the propertied classes have often relied on restrictions on free speech to suppress, you know, workers, the lower classes, without
Unions.
the ability to have representation, to speak out on, you know, on to unionize and so on. And so, World War One in the U.S., you see the first sort of Red Scare. You see a huge crackdown on dissent. Under the Sedition and Espionage Act, and that is being used both against, yeah, against political minorities, but also against racial minorities. You see huge surveillance and censorship at an unprecedented scale. With you know, someone like the presidential candidate of the Socialist Party is sentenced, I think, to 10 years in prison for giving a speech, an anti-war speech. Um, Pamphleteers, pacifists, radical pacifists, sentenced to 10 and 20 years for distributing nonviolent pamphlets on the streets of New York. And so certainly, the World War One is a very perilous time for free speech in America.
Can we talk a little bit about, and I know I'm kind of spanning over the whole thing and just picking out broader themes, but you talk about the elites being afraid of new technology, certainly technology that could, you know, alter the distribution of information and ideas. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that does go back in history some time.
Yeah. So basically, I identify two competing concepts of free speech that date back to ancient times. So the first is sort of an egalitarian conception of free speech based on the Athenian democracy. And of course, by our standards, the Athenian democracy is not radically egalitarian. Because, you know, it had slavery, it did not give political rights to women, and so on. But by its time, it was radically egalitarian. And then you have the Roman Republican model, which is a much more of a top-down elitist conception of free speech, where it's the well-educated, wealthy elite that gets to exercise free speech, but not the unwashed mob, unlike in Athens and Greece. And I see these two conceptions being in tension throughout the history of free speech. So whenever the public sphere is expanded, either through technological developments, so it could be the printing press, or through sort of the democratization, sort of, whether it's, you know, giving rights to women, to racial, religious minorities, to the propertyless, and so on. Those who are the institutional elites and gatekeepers of the public sphere tend to panic about the consequences of allowing, you know, the credulous, unwashed mob, or the dangerous racial minorities, or women, a voice in the public sphere, and therefore they try to insist on some kind of new forms of censorship.
Do you think, I mean, do you see echoes of that today? Because we do have things like the online harms bill in the UK, and in the EU we have various new directives, Digital Services Act and so on, coming out.
Yeah, I think
These,
there's a very very strong connection between previous attempts to keep out the lower classes or undesirable groups from having direct, unmediated access to the public sphere, and the way that governments and also the European Union is insisting that there should be some kind of top-down control with the so-called digital Wild West, that elites are so afraid of, and when it comes to disinformation and hate speech, and so on. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the empirical data about the harms of online speech um, does not necessarily support these wild claims. So, of course, disinformation is a real phenomenon. It's also true that states like Russia have tried to weaponize it against democracies. But for instance, the idea that Russian disinformation on social media swung the 2016 presidential election, which was almost an article of faith at one point, seems to rest on pretty slim evidence when you
it,
actually look at a number of studies.
well,
And
it's, if I can interrupt for a second, it seems to be a premise of EU legislation.
yeah, and what I think is sorely lacking also when it comes to the Digital Services Act is in fact sort of um, the empirical data and research, which supports the claims that the threat is actually as acute as described, and two, that restrictions on free speech is a necessary and proportionate remedy that will ameliorate these costs and harms that are involved in free speech, rather than maybe be both ineffectual and cause collateral damage to the whole ecosystem of information and opinion. But it becomes very, because the sheer, when you have social media platforms with potentially billions of people of users, then you can always find examples of extreme speech and even harmful speech, and you can also always find examples of online speech that leads to real harm. But if you just cherry pick and base legislations on a number of examples, then those examples might not be a representative sample of the entire ecosystem. So this idea that disinformation is flooding the internet seems to rest on pretty shallow empirical data. In fact, it seems that it's a relatively small number of people who are responsible for a large share of disinformation, and also that most people are not as susceptible to being swayed by disinformation and lies as elites fear. It's actually typically quite difficult to persuade people, but disinformation seems to be most effective when targeted at those who are already distrustful of the government, who already exhibits a lack of trust in institutions,
Looking for
democracy, and
confirmation.
so on. Yeah, so it's basically, if you're already a part of the MAGA movement and a committed Donald Trump supporter who believes that the deep state is real, that the elections were based on the big lie, despite all the evidence to the contrary, then disinformation might confirm your biases, but it's very unlikely to sway large parts of people who are not already on board.
I suppose I tend to be optimistic. I mean, my kind of reaction to 2020, and the events and the aftermath of the 2020 election was that the system okay, it came under stress, but it basically worked. Things worked. The sort of the plumbing of constitution actually just did function. And I guess it was alarming to some extent.
Yeah, I thought it was, it was too close a call, of course. And but I think, when you read the Senate report, it seemed to me that the authorities could have, it wouldn't have been a restriction of free speech if you went through the reams of data from not only from sort of mainstream social media platforms, but also from blogs and messaging services like Telegram and so on, that showed that there was an extremist minority who might be willing to use violence to sort of to try and force their way through, even though Trump had lost the election. And so you could have beefed up security measures and said, okay, we don't know for sure whether these people are willing to use violence, but we will have
more police
more police
at the
or
Capitol.
armed troops ready if they are to sort of overstep the line from words to action. That would have been in perfect keeping, and that would also have shown that you can actually, and this is actually an argument which I think is overlooked. I think ultimately, in open societies, it's a competitive advantage for authorities and democratic institutions and the public as such to have an insight into those who have extreme views, to know that they're out there, what they're thinking, the way that they're coordinating, so you can react accordingly, and that also you can try to engage with those people, in the last resort by using force. If people use force and arresting them, using surveillance, if they if they are a genuine threat, but in other ways, to try and engage with them. And see if you can if you can convince at least some of them to give up conspiracy theories and so on. And if that information is not out there, then it's not just going to go away. The extremists will still be there, but you will have less of an insight into who they are and what ideas they're spreading.
Do you see a danger? I mean, one of the things that struck me at the probably since 2016 in a way, and the reaction to Trump's election, was this idea that was widely accepted that disinformation had swung the vote. I mean, remember, it was the idea that a president wasn't properly democratically elected didn't start with Biden winning. It started with Trump winning. And the response to that was a lot of hysteria, obviously, about disinformation, a lot of hysteria about Russian interference and so on. But we're kind of potentially moving into a sort of an era of Milton's curse in our own right now, because we have governments, notwithstanding the various legislation that we've referred to, but we also have governments who are now keen to, and I don't think this is really covered in your book, actually. And I think it may be if you do a second edition or a sequel, but it's this idea that governments themselves seek to become the master manipulators.
Yeah.
They themselves seek to control narratives. That there's a behavioral insights unit in Downing Street, for example, in the UK, and they are quite happy, or at least seem to have been quite happy, to go as far as frightening people to behave accordingly, or accentuating crises like in climate or COVID or whatever it is, beyond perhaps what is truthful, in order to get people to behave in a way that they think is correct. I mean, this is a kind of I don't know if this is a Milton's curse, but it's the sort of a government not just saying you can't say what you want, but in fact we're going to fill that space with what we want to say, and we're going to manipulate you.
Yeah, and I think just when you look at the platforms that actually have transparency, will sort of list up the number of government requests for removals and so on, and it's quite clear that even in democracies, governments they may not, sometimes they'll go to courts and seek removals, but it's also clear that they seek to develop relationships with the biggest platforms and influence the way that their content moderation system operates. So a good example, before the DSA, you had the code of conduct on hate speech, for instance. So it's the European Commission,
Yeah.
Signing an agreement with a number of the
Microsoft
large
and all the
social
rest.
media
Yeah.
platforms
Yeah.
to remove illegal hate speech. Now, it's not legally binding, but it was very clear that the code of conduct was sort of an offer you can't refuse, right? From the
Yes.
Commission saying, okay, if you
They
don't
were tapping the
cooperate,
gun in their holster, you know.
exactly, if you're not cooperating with us, we'll just have to resort to legal measures. Now,
Yeah.
the platforms cooperated, but now they're still facing legal measures. And the
Of
same,
course.
you,
Yeah.
you 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 have something similar when it comes to disinformation, and the whole role of the Commission under the DSA as a regulator of sorts, which has powers to oversee um, content that is not even illegal when it comes to the very large platforms. To me, is very frightening. Sort of very, very broad and vague definitions of harms when it comes to disinformation and something, minors and health and so on. And, you don't have to sort of be into tinfoil hat Alex Jones territory to imagine that the Commission could use its powers, and because it's because it has powers, and those powers can be used to to punish the platforms. They could use it in an untransparent way. Say it would be
Yeah.
better if you remove this or that, and you already see that, for instance, with the regulation banning state-sponsored Russian media, which not only took away sort of the broadcasting license, but also really forced social media platforms to remove content from RT
Yep.
and so on. Even
Yeah.
if you wanted to share it to counter
Yeah.
Russian disinformation, you risk being so that to me is an example of how governments have sort of learned to navigate this space with it's the silver lining for worried elites, the silver lining of our much more centralized, platformized digital era, as opposed to sort of the initial decentralized internet, is that they can use the platforms as choke points,
Yeah.
and lean on them.
Yeah, and I mean, also you have, in relation to the current Ukrainian war, Peter Hitchens, the British journalist, has reported that he was going to give a talk, I think, somewhere in London, and the venue has cancelled the talk because they've been sort of threatened, and sponsors have got in touch with them and told them, you can't host. Hitchens is famously a critic of NATO's involvement or shadow involvement in the Ukrainian conflict. And so he sort of is saying that his view is being suppressed, around that, and the media, of course, are participating in this on a broader level. There was just something else, actually. I mean, your book, I guess if I were to sort of challenge you a little bit on the book, I would say, well, you've written a fantastic, but possibly a kind of a Whig history, which I mean I personally love, but that it's a great story, but that we are now in in sort of the 21st century, and we're living in a very technological age. We're living in an age where we have a sort of, I suppose, quasi technocracy in charge, and we defer to experts on so many things, and there is so much opinion coming out of universities from out of credentialized authorities in all sorts of areas, and governments are sort of just taking up these ideas, whether it's gender self-ID, whether it's information about hate speech and so on, or disinformation, and policies based on these things. One of the things I noticed was that during the pandemic, the COVID thing, people would often, if one was critical of the policy response of the public health authorities, one was sort of challenged. Well, are you a doctor? Which, and it was the first time in history that I know of that authorities had sort of delegated to people with quite narrow specialities, such a broad policy response. Do you think, I mean, if you're going to produce another edition of this book or an update of this book, you're going to have to, you know, somebody's going to have to come to terms with the fact that we are living in this very technological society where we do defer to experts a lot. Yeah, we live in a very managerialist society. You know, everything is codified. We have codes of everything. You know, diversity, equity, inclusion, and that this is kind of objectifying us all. It's turning us into objects. I'm reminded of what Foucault was saying about the health system, I think he said he wrote a book in the 60s talking about that, the sort of how people are treated in the health system. Suddenly we started being treated sometime around 1780, we started being treating as objects by doctors. Do you think that there is a possible, you know, that in other words, you've written this great account of how we achieve freedom of speech, but actually there's a danger it's all going to get away from us in a kind of technocracy?
Yeah, there's always a danger that free speech will get away from us, and free speech is never completely lost or won. You know, I think it's difficult to write. You know, it's much easier to write about, you know, what was the impact and of free speech and censorship in 19th century Europe from the vantage point of the 21st century. I think, you know, it's much more difficult to write an authoritative, if you like, history of the digital era of the 21st century in 2023, just because I think
It's happening.
right now we're sort of in a period in where sort of the first 20, 30 years after the printing press. And I think we're in for a lot more disruption, uncertainty going forward before we sort of adjust our institution, our mental modes, our culture to the digital age. But, you know, I think that there's a good possibility that we can and will, and that I think a lot of the impetus for that will not necessarily come, you know, some of it will come from governments. That, you mean, obviously, you know, there are needs for legislation on some points, not so much when it, in my opinion, when it comes to regulating viewpoints of speech, but around technology, you certainly do need some legislation. But I think a lot of it also has to do with, you know, when you sort of legislate on the basis of how Facebook and YouTube operate or allegedly operate, then that misses the point that these are relatively new companies, and that there's a lot of technological development going on. It's not a given that Facebook and YouTube, Google will have the same influence, or that their products will be the same, you know, 10 years from now. It might be, that's what I'm hoping for, a much more decentralized environment. So we move towards something, an updated version of the more decentralized social media environment that was the original promise of the internet. And then those initiatives, legislative initiatives that are being passed now, will be completely out of touch, and our understanding of the digital sphere will that are prevalent now will no longer be relevant. But this is all, you know, we don't know how it will play out. But, you know, if you looked at the first newspapers that were being produced, they look very different from journalism today. If you look at the first, you know, radio shows, they look very different from radio. So of course we develop a technology, we develop new practices, new cultures, we improve, and so on. And so my hope, and I'm cautiously optimistic will be the case, is that we'll update our institutions, our culture, our mental modes accordingly, and we will, you know, see that many of the dangers that we thought were sort of existential may not be as bad when it comes to sort of disinformation and hate speech and so on. AI might be, you know, more of a threat, but that has less to do sort of with free speech per se.
I'm minded by our use of mobile telephones, and that when these first became ubiquitous, there was a lack of knowledge about the etiquette of their use. And so, people would use them in restaurants and the rest of it. And eventually we sort of settled down to a mobile phone etiquette. And I suspect that this will happen with a lot of technology. Now, that said, I think digital platforms like Twitter and Facebook have been responsible for getting extra clicks due to stoking controversy in terms of their algorithms. And I think, my view is that if platforms are to be responsible, they should. I think you can promote debate and facilitate debate and discussion and diversity of ideas without promoting actual conflict.
Yeah, and also the business model of the whole business model of getting as much personal data about you, that might not be the business model that thrives in the future as we get more and more, cognizant of how much they actually data they have about us, and how that can be used potentially to manipulate. So if we had if the future platforms eliminated some of the bad part, the same way that um, cars at one point would drive on unleaded gasoline. That was useful for getting from A to B, but it had some unintended negative consequences. Or you didn't have seat belts, you didn't have sophisticated braking systems that you do today. Hopefully, that will be the way that social media develops, and the digital sphere develops, at least in democracies. Of course, I don't expect that to be the case in authoritarian states. But the tragedy of the current trajectory, I think, is that democracies are basically building systems that can be sort of serve as the blueprint for authoritarian states, and they can then, ramp up the authoritarian elements of those kinds of legislation passed in democracies, and then they can say, well, we're just doing what they're doing in the European Union or in Germany.
This is kind of this kind of alludes to your Weimar fallacy, doesn't it, in a way?
Yes, this is, the Weimar fallacy is this idea that, which is behind much of hate speech. The reasoning behind hate speech laws in Europe is that, the Nazis came into power through democratic means, even if they never had a clear majority. And that shows the danger of accommodating totalitarian, anti-democratic movements in democracies. But as I try to show in the book, the Weimar Republic, the short-lived Weimar Republic, in Germany actually had it was certainly an improvement when it comes to free speech upon Imperial Germany and what went before that. But there were increasingly draconian restrictive measures on free speech, and they were very often used against the Nazis. And those speech restrictions that were adopted to protect democracy were, when the Nazis came into power, used to destroy the very democracy they were supposed to protect, including abolishing or suspending free speech, which was part of the emergency provisions in the Weimar constitutions.
Yeah,
Weimar Constitution.
Yeah, I think after the Reichstag fire, was it?
After the Reichstag fire. But even before the Reichstag fire, there were emergency laws, for instance, that could be used to shut down newspapers that spread false information. And so the Nazis used that to shut down social democratic and communist newspapers. And then when the Reichstag fire came, then free speech, freedom of association were simply eliminated, and you could just imprison without trial or habeas corpus political opponents, ban political parties, and within 6 months you had in essence created a one-party totalitarian state.
You alluded talking about, say, today's politics and where we're at as a society. You alluded in the book to an opinion poll, I think, and you said that the Scandinavians generally had the highest support for freedom of press, freedom of speech. and the Americans. And I could be wrong, but I don't think, did you mention other countries? Did you mention the UK?
Yeah, we have we did a survey
Mm,
of 33 countries' attitudes um, around the world, and it's true. I think the Scandinavian countries were at the very top, with the US coming in at third or fourth, when you combined
mm,
various measures. So obviously, the support for free speech is high comparatively in the United States.
mm,
But I might have imagined that it would be even higher. And it seems that in the US, political polarization has eroded support for free speech. So people on the left, and I'm speaking sort of, I'm generalizing here because it's certainly not true for everyone on the left, but people on the left tend to be more suspicious of free speech now because they view it as being weaponized against minorities and entrenching unequal power
yeah,
relations.
yeah.
So,
And they
so
believe in
they see it as a,
disinformation.
yeah, and disinformation is also a big thing that
Mm,
threatens a democracy. And then people on the right, conservatives, will on the one hand say, "Oh, the left are destroying free speech through cancel culture and wokeism run amok," but then turn around and then they'll, Republicans in Florida will pass laws restricting free speech in higher education,
mm,
and sort of use censorship and restrictions as a way to energize their base. And I think that is a terrible development for free speech when
mm.
each political faction is using free speech as sort of a selective prop to
Do
invoke
you see
when
though? I mean, do you see what, say, Ron DeSantis is doing as equivalent
yeah, I think
to,
it's using state power, and
yeah,
one of his laws has been blocked by a judge as
yeah,
violating the First Amendment. So I see that, and you see increasingly book bans in libraries and so on. So in many ways, I see the Republican reaction, if you accept it as such,
mm,
as being very authoritarian
mm,
minded. Um, of course, then it doesn't help when people on the left then come out and say, "Oh, the Republicans are now restricting free speech," when they, for a very long time, were saying, "Oh, there's no such thing as cancel culture. It's just conservative grievances. It doesn't exist." Well,
yeah,
the conservatives are doing with legal measures what you had tried to do with private power for
yeah. It's an
and so
interesting
you need
case.
to.
I mean, that you're a lawyer, so it'd be interesting to know. But I mean, my read of the Florida thing was that at least the case being made by the conservatives was, there are no First Amendment rights in the classroom.
Yeah, but
Um,
I think you have to distinguish here between sort of elementary school or K through 12 and then
or
higher
university.
education, and and
Yeah.
and 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 some of these measures were also aimed at universities, and that's
Mm.
where this judge, and I'm not an expert on the First Amendment, but said that blocked it because it sort of flew in the face of the First Amendment.
Mm.
So so um, so I certainly see these Republican attempts at pushing back against CRT. I mean, in many ways, the irony is that these Republican speech codes look very much like progressive hate speech codes, right? The language is eerily similar. So it's
But
the distorted mirror image, and each
yeah,
side believes that it has sort of, the end justifies the means.
yeah, it does
Um,
concern me in a way that conservatives tend to, and maybe we're slightly on a sidetrack here, but it's an interesting one. Where conservatives, like people like Jordan Peterson, for example, and various other kind of conservative podcasters, tend to blame, you know, what they call French postmodern philosophers, people like Foucault and Derrida and so on, for all these ideas in universities. Whereas, in fact, when you actually read certainly someone like Foucault, you have actually quite almost libertarian challenges to state power and state authority. And I'm not sure if they're reading him in the right way. I think what they're partly reacting to is a sort of reception of these philosophers in American universities in the 1970s, where perhaps they weren't properly digested or understood.
Yeah, and I think, I also think that, I think sort of critical theory has probably, if you go back to some of the original stuff, it was probably less in favor of restricting free speech than some of the modern offshoots of it.
It was. Yeah, I mean, I think people like Marcuse and Adorno and things were very worried about the sort of technological media, commercialization society, and America in the 50s really gave them, the pip.
Yeah, Marcuse is probably someone who's pretty extreme who unfortunately has been influential in when it comes to sort of saying that you need to be intolerant of the intolerant to
yes. This
to
is the
paraphrase
paradox.
Karl Popper,
yes, who's
a very different thinker and someone who I actually admire quite a bit. And you could also sort of see where Karl Popper writes his book.
Which book did he
exile.
argue? What was it, The Open Society? He argued
The Open Society, yes, and he writes that in exile in New Zealand.
44.
Yeah, so
give or take.
Yeah, I think 1945 or 44. So you can understand why he's extremely worried. Though, as I said, I think the Weimar fallacy is a counter argument to Popper, and also the way that we talk a lot about Nazism, but communism arguably has been, just because communism was vastly more successful than Nazism in spreading and lasting. And therefore, the consequences on censorship and repression has been much more severe under communism. And communist states were very clever in using saying, well, we can't tolerate fascism and Nazism, and therefore we need to have laws against hate speech. So it was basically a communist idea to have hate speech laws in international human rights law.
To suppress domestic opposition.
Exactly. That became very clear that if you look at what happened in countries like Hungary, like Romania, Bulgaria, you would see that very shortly after World War II, the Allies imposed obligations on these countries to prohibit fascist movements and movements that threaten democracy, and these were immediately seized upon by communists to crack down on all dissent. And then suddenly, everyone from your democratic socialist to a conservative was a fascist that needed to be removed, and only communists were true Democrats.
Yeah, this in fact was a narrative that was. I mean, in a way, I think this idea of, I suppose, the media talk about the far right and so on being this big threat. Now, I think even, you obviously, it concerns you, but I've always thought that the far right in Europe and America generally are a fairly, minority support. I remember saying to somebody, I was in America last July and I was having a conversation with somebody, and I sort of said, look, the number of actual white supremacists in America who would be willing to murder, somebody for their beliefs is it's probably a dozen at most. It's not like a million brown shirts, of 3 million brown shirts.
I think it's probably more than and I think there's been an uptick, but it's certainly not, I would agree that
it's not a mass movement.
No, I mean, obviously the US is a place where there's still racism is still a thing, and a big issue, but it's also undeniable, at least in my opinion, that there's been real and substantial progress. If you look at attitudes towards interracial marriage now, there's almost universal acceptance. Back in 1958, it was 4%. There was, if you go to the 50s and 40s, black people could be lynched or with impunity in the South.
Sure. Mm,
That is that, and you know, few people would take notice, and that is not the case anymore. Then you still have huge issues like mass incarceration of blacks at a hugely
mm,
disproportional rate and so on.
mm,
But I think it's, you know, I think if you go back to sort of the Jim Crow days, you could have KKK members that were, you know, in collusion with government. I think that would probably not be the case today. So
mm,
certainly there has been progress, and in Europe, you know, certainly have far right violent movements, even in Germany.
yes, there was that
But
attempted
it's
coup.
interesting. What is interesting is we actually have some data. So it's a Norwegian political scientist who has this interesting study where he argues that those Western European countries that does the most to suppress right-wing extremism are also the ones who has experiences the most violent right-wing extremist reactions. And so he suggests
Mm,
that when it comes to violent right-wing extremism, cracking down on it, suppressing it might be something that triggers more violent reaction.
mm,
So that, you know, I think is something that you want to take into account when you think
mm,
about free speech. This idea that, oh, here's a violent extremist movement. If we only shut them up, then we'll solve the problem.
mm,
It's intuitively appealing. It also appeals to politicians because it shows that you're willing to do something very symbolically and very visible about extremist movements. But it may
mm,
not necessarily solve the problem. Sometimes it might even make it worse. And of course, depending on how you define extremism and so on, it might be used much broader than you had imagined. And when someone else comes into power, it might be when you've abandoned principle, it could be, you know, it could be mashed up and used against very different people. So that's, you know, some of the inherent dangers of this approach to extreme speech.
yeah, I suppose I mean, the way I see it is that this, I mean, I do see a kind of a connection between, I suppose, this Soviet attitude or tactic in the 50s, just after the war, to label any opposition, you know, fascist, which of course, and you see this whole debate playing out in the UN with people like Eleanor Roosevelt, which I think you talk about, stepping up and sort of standing up for the sort of a more freedom of speech, classical liberal kind of position, Whig position. But I think there's some connection between the Soviet tactic of doing that, and you see echoes of it a little bit today, where you know, anything that's not on board with a fairly strong left-wing perception of certain things is labeled fascist, which is a kind of a way of shutting down debate, you know, and sort of stopping you from talking.
Yeah, and that's probably more of a cultural thing,
Mm,
where you know, where and this is also one of the ironic things is, you know, in my book I try to show that free speech has actually been the most important weapon for any oppressed or marginalized, victimized group, whether it be racial, religious minorities, you know, LGBT movements, women, and censorship and repression has been the preferred instrument of supremacists of all kinds. But now
mm,
there's this idea that free speech is a weapon against minorities, that it entrenches unequal power relations, and that is just completely at odds with the historical reality. And so these attempts to sort of say, well, you know, real tolerance and equality requires suppression of speech, I think is incredibly at odds with sort of
mm,
progressivism properly understood.
mm. I mean, let me ask you a final question then, Jacob. I mean, how optimistic or pessimistic are you, given the direction of legislation, and we'll just take Europe and the US, about where all this is going?
Yeah, so it's interesting that, you know, in Europe, it's very much, Digital Services Act, saying, we want to ensure that platforms remove illegal and maybe even harmful content. In the US, you see attempts of saying, well, no, platforms can't or shouldn't remove anything. So it's two very different approaches. That's sort of more the conservative approach to it, with laws that are likely to go before this, that I think will probably go before the Supreme Court. On the other hand, I think Democrats in the U.S. would like to move more in a European way. That certainly Hillary Clinton was very happy about the Digital Services Act, for instance. But look, I think that the Digital Services Act is likely to demonstrate the impossibility of sort of regulating online speech at scale with a top-down approach. I think we're likely to see that the unintended consequences will become unmanageable, and if those unintended consequences start affecting ordinary citizens, I think that there might be a backlash. And then I also think the technological development, if we move to more smaller, more nimble, decentralized platforms, then the whole design of the DSA becomes much less relevant to the new environment. So in that sense, I think that I'm hopeful that this this, even if born out of good intentions, the Digital Services Act, I think basically anytime there's been attempts to sort of impose top-down centralized control of information and opinion, I think that has been detrimental to free speech, generally speaking, whereas a more decentralized ecosystem has been something that has allowed free speech to flourish much more. So I hope that's the way we'll be moving in, at least in democracies. And also we need that more decentralized, bottom-up approach to circumvent official propaganda and censorship in authoritarian states, to help dissidents and the persecuted in those states.
That's great. Well, thank you very much, Jacob. And I just want to plug your book again, Free Speech: A Global History from Socrates to Social Media. This is a fantastic book, the best history, I think, ever written on the subject. So many, many thanks for your time. That was very, very, very useful. Thank you.